Chapter 4, Environmental Health Hazards. In this chapter, we're going to talk about ways that different things in the environment, both living and non-living, naturally occurring and man-made, things that can actually impact human health. So things that are capable of either causing disease, such as bacteria and viruses, or otherwise pollutants that we find that are human-made that can also impact human health as well. So we're going to talk about these environmental health hazards. We'll talk about how these hazards move through the environment, and then we'll also look at determining the health effects of some of these pollutants. So the first major point that we need to talk about, big point number one, is what is a toxicant? So toxicants are chemicals that have an adverse effect on health. In general, the rule is that any chemical is toxic if the exposure is large enough or long enough. So anything is technically capable of making us ill if we're exposed to a high enough dose of it, or if we're exposed to it chronically over time. Toxicology is what we use to study the effects of these toxicants on living organisms. It studies the different ways that these things make us sick and develops ways to either prevent or minimize these types of adverse effects. The other thing that we talk about when we're discussing environmental health is looking at the study of what's called epidemiology. And epidemiology is the study of the effects of these toxicants, but also biological diseases and even physical agents on the health of human populations. So in epidemiology, we're looking at large groups of people, and we're trying to figure out how they contracted a particular type of disease, or how they were injured by in a particular accident, or whatever it happens to be. So these are studies of large groups of people versus just looking at individuals like we were with toxicology. So keeping on this theme here of these toxicants, we can look at different types of toxicity. We can talk about something that's acutely toxic or chronically toxic. Something that's acutely toxic is where you have immediate effect after a single exposure. So it can typically it's in small doses versus, or it could be in a large dose. It doesn't really matter. But an acutely toxic substance is something that causes some type of almost immediate physical reaction, whether it's dizziness, nausea, death, lung problems, whatever it happens to be. There aren't a whole lot of acutely toxic substances that we're exposed to on a daily basis. More often than not, you're likely to be exposed to things that are chronically toxic. So these are things that when you're exposed to over very long periods of time, you will probably see adverse effects. Cigarette smoke is a perfect example, whether it's first-hand smoke or second-hand smoke. This would be something that's chronically toxic. So the more you're exposed to it, the more adverse effects you're going to see on your health. In addition to toxic things in the environment, man-made chemicals. The next thing, big point number 2, we're going to talk about are disease-causing agents in the environment. And these are things that are living organisms. We call these pathogens. Anything that can make us sick is called a pathogen when it comes to something living. These are usually in the forms of microorganisms, including viruses, bacteria, and little things that live in the water called protozoa. You can mostly get these through the environment, meaning they're transmissible through contaminated water or food. Some of these are airborne, for example. That's where you're going to find most of these disease-causing agents. Other times you have things that are non-transmissible in the environment that are only transmissible through bodily fluids. If you think of HIV, for example, HIV can only be contracted through immediate contact from bodily fluids, and it's bodily fluid to bodily fluid. So that's another type of transmissible disease-causing agent. Most of the problems that we see, especially in developing countries when it comes to these disease-causing agents, is in the form of contaminated drinking water. Drinking water is not something that is treated in most parts of the world, and so what we see is a very big threat to public health because of sewage flowing into the same place where people are actually getting their drinking water. So what we have is a whole host of different types of diseases caused by different types of bacteria, viruses, and protozoa that cause diseases, including severe diarrhea. We have vomiting, muscle aches, general discomfort. So all of these diseases, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, all of these are caused by, again, contaminated drinking water. So what we see is that in especially developing places where you have this sort of lag between access to medical health or access to clean water, and you have growing populations, it becomes much and much more prevalent. 25% of injury and disease is related to human-caused environmental changes. And again, some things like contaminated drinking water are very obvious. Sometimes the environmental impact isn't quite as obvious. Let's say we are doing some development in a forested area, and we begin to cut down trees, and we're going into areas where previously humans weren't there. All of a sudden now we're exposing ourselves to different types of disease-causing agents, mosquitoes in particular, and giving them an opportunity to interact with humans, which previously wasn't the case until we went into these natural areas. There's also a lot of social factors that impact the spread of these diseases. So the more people we have and the closer they are in contact with each other, the more likely it is we're going to get these things to spread, especially mosquito-borne diseases. We have a whole host of different diseases, including malaria, but even things like Zika virus, which has actually become much bigger in the news lately because of its spread here into the United States even. And again, all of this is because of the expanding tropical climate conditions that these mosquitoes need to survive. And as the climate becomes warmer and moister for them, they're able to spread into new territories. So what we're seeing here is a consequence of changing environmental conditions. We're actually spreading more diseases. Very briefly, I talk about a pandemic is something where we have a disease that reaches nearly all parts of the world. The swine flu back in 2009, if you remember, was probably the last time we've had a global pandemic, and they're almost always flu-related. The flu is especially deadly to the very young, the very old, and what we call the immunocompromised, people who have other conditions that make their immune system not work as well. So the next big point here, big point number 3 we're going to talk about is how these toxicants move in the environment. Some things, ideally, a chemical that we used to make something would break down almost immediately in the environment when it's released, and it would break down into harmless components that wouldn't harm anybody. That would be an ideal chemical for us to use. Unfortunately, the most dangerous toxicants are the ones that resist degradation. They stay intact. They travel very, very quickly in the environment, and they're usually radioactive. An example of a dangerous type of toxicant was DDT. This is a pesticide that was largely used here in the United States and all over the world. What happened, though, is that we began to see different types of birds, populations sharply declining, and they actually traced it back to DDT. And what was happening was that DDT was a very persistent type of toxicant. It stuck around in the environment for a long time, and it bioaccumulated in body tissues. So the more animals came in contact with it, the more of it would build up in their tissues. And that's called bioaccumulation. The other thing that compounded this problem was the fact that as you move up the food chain and you eat more and more contaminated food, the amount of the contaminant you come into contact with increases. And so those birds at the top of the food chain were the ones who were most severely impacted by DDT. And what was happening is it was making the shells of their eggs very brittle, and they would crack before the babies would hatch. And so we had a huge loss in populations of big birds. So think of eagles and peregrine and falcons and red-tailed hawks and all of these large birds of prey, we saw declining populations, and because of this accumulating amount of chemical DDT that was in their tissues. So the next big point is toxicity measures and how we actually figure out what dose is safe enough to be exposed to. And what we do is we look at something called a dose response curve. A dose response curve. And what it is we look at the lethal dose versus the sublethal dose. So these doses are measured in milligrams or kilograms of body weight. Okay, so how much of this can we be exposed to before it causes harm? Finding the lethal dose is a process. You administer different doses to lab animals. The amount that kills 50% of the test animals is called the LD50. What we need to know about the LD50 is the smaller the number, it means the more toxic the chemical. So in very, very tiny doses, this is very, very powerful. So for example, let's look at the LD50 for a variety of things. Okay, here's the lethal dose 50 for aspirin. Okay, it's a pretty large number. You would have to ingest an awful lot of aspirin in order to have a lethal dose. As you move down this list, you see things that become more dangerous in much, much smaller doses. Strychnine is our sort of smallest here. So a very small amount of strychnine can be very, very deadly. So in addition to the LD50, we look at something called the ED50. It's called the effective dose. It causes 50% of the population to exhibit a response. And it's not death in this case. It's just something happens to them because of their exposure to this chemical. We use the ED50 and the LD50 to come up with threshold levels. Threshold levels are the maximum dose that we can take and not have any type of effect. So we use these things called dose response curves, and all you really need to know about the dose response curve is that essentially we can ingest this much of a particular substance and nothing at all will happen, and then after this much we begin to see an impact. So that's kind of what we're looking for, is at what level is it safe. This is called the threshold level. Last point here is known as, we're going to talk about something called the precautionary principle. And it kind of fits into this chapter because we've been discussing these chemicals, these toxicants, and whether or not they are safe for exposure in the environment, or whether they are safe exposure for humans in general. There's this principle called the precautionary principle that simply states that we should not use a new technology or practice or material until we can demonstrate that the risks of harm are small, that the benefits outweigh the risks, and it puts the burden of proof onto the people developing whatever it happens to be. Essentially, the idea is, let's prove that this is safe before we actually use it, instead of finding out that it's harmful after the fact. We kind of use a saying called an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. A lot of people would say, well, yeah, of course, that's common sense. Why don't we do it? But in general, that's not the way it works. In general, what we see is we typically, especially here in the United States, we act and introduce something first, and then we wait to see if it's harmful later. That's a different approach than what other parts of the world do, especially the European Union. They have a more precautionary look at things, and they say, hold off, let's see if this is okay first before we introduce it. So hormones in cattle, for example, are commonly used in the United States and Canada. European nations have said, nope, we're not going to do that. We don't know what the impact of ingesting those hormones might be. So that's all for Chapter 4. Again, please make sure that you go through the notes in their entirety in order to be able to understand vocabulary and concepts that were discussed.